Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro.
Oh,
I'm sorry. We're supposed to do the tagline. I keep
Or
forgetting.
Bible Bistro.
You need to write that. If you could give me the musical notation, we might be able to do that.
If I go Bible Bistro.
No, I don't like that.
Bible Bistro.
No. So, anyway,
Fine.
it's good to be here. It's good to be back in the bistro.
It is. Yes, it is good to be back.
Any bistro. You know what I always say? Any bistro day is a good day.
I know what you usually say. I'm not sure. I was waiting to see if you could actually recall what you usually say.
I usually say, this is the podcast all about things about... This is a podcast all about things...
The Bible, theology, and all things relating to the
pertaining
Christian.
to the Christian faith.
Yes, that's usually what happens. But that's what this podcast is about. It's all about the
Bible and theology.
and all things related to the Christian life.
Yeah.
So we're back. And so today I'm here, but I'm not here.
Because of the magic of podcasts.
Because of the magic of podcast, also called pre-recording.
And this is seriously really exciting stuff.
Yes. So
we mentioned before that you're going to be traveling to Egypt.
Yes. So this will be released September today.
Mm-hmm.
If you're listening to this on the Tuesday day it's released. I mean, if you don't listen on release day, are you even real?
Well, I mean, not one of the faithful 50.
That's right. I am coming back from Egypt today on September 18th.
Right.
Barring any unforeseen incidents.
Well,
so
if not, we won't release this episode.
Well, you can release it posthumous. Is that what you say? Anyway.
And we'll have a in memoriam at the end.
Memoriam of the one other guy on the podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm coming back from Egypt. So the previous 2 weeks I have been in Egypt for a week and in Jordan, and we've been exploring Egypt, like what the Exodus would have been like, what the Israelites would have experienced. Again, obviously it's modern Egypt, but looking at what life would have been like back then.
I'm very excited for you. That's going to be a great trip. And so next week,
the 25th
in podcast time.
In podcast time.
Then you're going to talk about your trip some and talk about some of your experiences, and I'm really looking forward to that. It should be really good. That should be that's a do not miss episode, is all I like to call them.
We're going to spend. We're hiking up in the day, and we're going to spend the night on Mount Sinai or Mount Sinai.
I would pronounce it Sinai,
but you are Southern Indiana, so anyway,
which means we can talk any way we want to.
That's right. But we're hiking up and we're spending the night. We're going to be filming as the sun goes down.
And then
we'll be getting up early as the sun comes up.
So you're going to spend the night on Mount Sinai.
Yes.
Moses did that for 40 days.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'll see any.
And he had 15 commandments, and he came down and saw the golden calf. And
no, I think that's the wrong movie. So you will be, it'll be interesting. I mean, I'm really excited. You'll have all sorts of interesting experiences to talk about. So make sure to take good notes and think about, all these things.
There's we're doing a lot of work. You know what I mean? Like that's part of the trip. But I'm taking a lot of notes, and I'm going to take some photos as well. We're going to see the Temple of Karnak in Egypt. So
Karnak the Great.
This is not a Johnny Carson.
Oh, okay.
Holding an envelope on his head. No. So we're gonna sail down the Nile.
Well, he was Karnak the Magnificent. Anyway,
I don't know.
Sail down the Nile on a boat.
On a boat.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'm on a boat.
Wait, what kind of boat is it?
I think it's called a flucka.
Okay, and it's
traditional,
like
a traditional
Egyptian boat.
Yes, is the answer. So we'll be down the Nile.
And you're going to Jordan too.
We're going
correct?
to Jordan as well. Yes. So we're going to
and spend some. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to go to
I don't want to give it all away.
Yeah, we're gonna see the Red Sea. We're gonna go to Wadi Rum. We're gonna see the wilderness they would have gone through.
Cool.
We're trying to, and it might be for a separate thing. We're gonna try to get into Petra and film a little bit in Petra, and we're gonna go to Mount Nebo where Moses would have
Deuteronomy, whole book of Deuteronomy.
Looked at the promised land that he didn't get to go into, but got to lead him into. So I'm on my way back as this is being.
Right, you're on the flight, so to
broadcast.
speak.
Hopefully, I will be landing very soon.
Okay.
I will be tired.
All
yes.
right. Yeah, I'm sure. It should be a long. I'm excited for you. That's going to be a really great trip. So I thought today we'd talk about the Exodus, kind of prepare you a little bit for the trip. And
I'm so glad I've never read it.
Well, I know you have.
Without you, Brian.
There are. Oh, come on. There's some interesting things about it, though, I think, that that we don't often think about. But you know the story of the Exodus. Of course, the Joseph's family went down into a part of Egypt. They settled in the land of Goshen. But then after a period of time, Exodus begins by saying that, Exodus chapter 1 says, after a period of time, that a Pharaoh rose who no longer knew Joseph. Of course, remember, Joseph had done lots on behalf of Egypt because he had this dream, a couple of dreams, and had helped not only, well, I should say he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, but then he also was able to help Egypt prepare for the years of famine they were going to experience. So he helped Egypt really become a powerful force in this period of time. But then it says a Pharaoh arose who did no longer know Joseph. We probably think this was a change in dynasty from one family to the other. And so then the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, became slaves in Egypt for a period of time, 400 years or so. And so that's the period of time we're in. And then, of course, God eventually raised up this leader, a very important leader. You know, we call him the lawgiver. You know, one of the most significant characters in the Old Testament, Moses.
Right.
Now, I was going to tell you a couple of things about Moses I think is interesting, because you remember what happened is the Israelites were becoming very numerous. The Egyptians were afraid that they were going to either fight against them. If some enemy were to attack, it would weaken them from within. But it's a kind of a sad thing, but they were really wanting to maintain the workforce that they had to be in slavery, but they didn't want to let them to have a military power and presence. And so they commanded that all the male children should be killed. All the female children were allowed to be left alive, and the male children would be killed. You remember at first the midwives wouldn't do this, but finally the command was, Pharaoh said, well, if you find any of these children, to be thrown into the Nile. Now, there's a couple of things there. And of course, the Nile was an important, continues to be an important part of Egypt. If you look at a map of Egypt, I'll encourage you to do this. Look at from above, maybe a photo from a satellite.
Yeah.
All the tributaries of the Nile and what we call the Nile Delta region. It's
green.
Yeah, it's and people don't think of that. Egypt, they think of desert and that kind of stuff, but it's actually the breadbasket of this part of the world, especially in this period of time. And so the Nile was worshipped as a god, and that's something we get to in just a minute. Is Egypt's religious system? It's a polytheistic religion, which means that they worship many gods. But the Nile was really worshipped during this period of time. And so these babies being thrown into the Nile, we have other examples of this where it was seen as sacrifice or something along those lines. But there was this child born to two Levite parents. So these are two people who were descended from Jacob's son Levi, and this man and this woman have this child. So he's fully a Levite, right? Full from the tribe of Levi. And in order to protect him, what they do is they place him in this basket. Now, it's not the way we'd see it depicted in movies like The Prince of Egypt or whatever, but actually this young child's sister, whose name's Miriam, is sent by her mother to go down and watch and to see what happens. And so they kind of place it, and I think they intentionally do this. The scripture doesn't necessarily say this, but I think they intentionally place the basket in a place where Pharaoh's daughter, it says it's a place where Pharaoh's daughter would come down in the morning to wash in the Nile. There are these ceremonial ablutions that they would do, these ceremonial washings that they would do in the morning. And so when she comes down, she finds this baby. So look at, this is in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 5. I'll go ahead and read this because there's a couple of interesting things here, I think. Then, you got it? Exodus 2:5. Exodus chapter 2, verse 5. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. So she knew who he was.
Right.
Then his sister, so this is Miriam, asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? This is something a lot of people don't realize, because again, they're going by the movies like Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt or whatever. But Moses is able to go back to his mother's house and actually nurse until the time that he's weaned, lives with his mother and father. So yes, go. So the girl went, got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby, nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So it's not immediately. And basically what happens is the Pharaoh's daughter then protects child. But now I want you to notice the rest of this verse. This is really what I was getting at. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now, that name Moses is pretty interesting. I drew him out. And literally, it is well, I shouldn't say literally. It's a figurative way, actually, to talk about birth. If you think about a child being born, they're drawn out from their mother, right? So this idea of drawing him out of the Nile, I wonder, it's almost, and again, speculation, but I need to be careful here, but I drew him out of the Nile, almost like born of the Nile. And there's a way in which Moses was born of the Nile. Now, here's the thing, again, we sometimes miss, is Moses, or Moshe, was a pretty common pharaonic name, a name that pharaohs had. If you think about it. So what are some of your most famous pharaohs? Name a pharaoh, any pharaoh. Ramses. So he is... So what was, see the MSS there, Mises, which means to be drawn out or to be born of, but he's born of Ray. Oh. And who's Ray? Or
Sun God.
Sun God, yeah, not Ray Charles, but...
famous piano player.
Ray. So he was born of Ray. And of course, Ramses, one of the things we know about Ramses the Great is what he's often called. He's one of the possible pharaohs of the Exodus. And I don't want to necessarily get into the dating of it right here in this time, although it's an interesting concept and an interesting idea. But he was one who actually made... Ramses was one who made Ray a central part of the worship. The sun god became a central part of the Egyptian religion during that period of time. But you see what I'm saying? He's saying, I'm born of Ray. I'm the son of Ray, is kind of the idea. Now, I sense he's one of the possible pharaohs of the Exodus, we say. Who's another one? Do you know any others that are...
I don't.
Okay, so there's another one whose name is Thutmoses III. Did you see that name there again? Moses. Thut. Or Thut is the idea of the sky god. So born of Thut. So here's the interesting thing. We don't think of this often, but Moses is a very good name.
Why isn't he called Nile Moses?
I think he may have been, and again, that's speculation. So you get what I'm saying? Born of the Nile, right? So I drew him out from the Nile, so I'm going to call him Moses. But then, we just shorten it and we end up with Moshe, because of course later on he's not a polytheist. He doesn't accept the Egyptian religion, right? And eventually the true God, the creator God, appears to him, and we know that whole story in the form of a burning bush, and speaks to him. And actually, one of the significant things about Moses is he says, well, what's your name? which is a good question if you've been raised in a polytheistic culture, right? Which God shall I say has sent me? And of course, God says, well, you tell him I am. Tell him I am has sent me. So just something to think about there. And that's really what I wanted to kind of focus on. There's lots of ways we can talk about the Exodus, but most people who study this say that of course, we know the plagues.
Yes.
When God sends Moses down, he gives him first of all, he gives him some miracles he's going to show Pharaoh, to show God's ability. You remember he puts his hand in his cloak, comes out leprous. He puts it back in. It's like a baby's skin, and has this staff, you remember?
That turns into a serpent.
And he throws it down. And so here's what we don't often think of, but most people understand, and the scriptures actually give us a couple of hints of this, that all of this is really in a way, a battle between the true God and the false gods of Egypt. And I'm going to show you in Scripture where it says this. Look at Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12. Now, this is skipping ahead a little bit, and we're going to come back and look at some other stuff. But in Exodus chapter 12, we're looking at the preparations for Passover. And of course, the very last of the 10 plagues is the death of the firstborn. But it's connected with this idea of the Passover feast. But look at what it says here in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. Go ahead and read that for me. And this is interesting.
On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt.
Go ahead and finish it.
Yeah. I am the Lord.
Okay, so you get what I'm saying. He's saying, I'm bringing judgment on the gods of Egypt. And he says, I am. And in our scripture it says the Lord, but that's all capitals. And I don't know if we've talked about this before on here or not, but that's the name we often pronounce. We don't know how it's pronounced, but we pronounce Yahweh. This is God's covenant name, we say sometimes, that God revealed to Moses when he said to him, who shall I say sent him? When you tell him, I am. Yahweh has sent you. And so I am Yahweh. I'm bringing judgment on all the gods of Egypt. In other words, the true God is showing his power over the gods of Egypt and the things that the Egyptians worshiped him for. So if you think about the 10 plagues, I think we see this. What you remember the first plague? Well, let me actually go back before I said that, because when Moses appears before Pharaoh, there are other people there. Do you remember the Egyptian magicians that are there?
Yes.
And so not only does Moses cast down his staff and it becomes a snake, but they cast down theirs.
And
it says by their secret arts or by their magic arts, they do the same thing. But then Moses' snake eats their snakes. And even in that first kind of, I don't know how you want to say it, that sparring match in the beginning of this battle, God is shown to be superior to the Egyptian magicians. There's kind of an interesting progression, because initially, the first couple of plagues, the Egyptian magicians are able to duplicate to a limited extent. They're able to show that they have the same kind of power that Moses is displaying. The first two, and then they get to the third plague, and that's the plague of gnats, and they're not able to replicate it. By the time they get to the sixth plague, which is the plague, I believe, of plague of boils. I think I'm right in saying that. I know you have it memorized. But in the sixth plague, the plague of boils, it says that the Egyptian magicians are so badly affected by that they're not even able to come and stand before Moses. So you see that progression. They go from saying, "Oh, we can do the same kind of thing,"
to like being incapacitated.
Exactly. And so again, it's God showing, I'm greater than, Moses, my servant is greater than these magicians of Egypt. So all that having been said, the first plague, do you remember, is what then?
I don't know.
The Nile River
turned
to blood, right? And so again, what happens is Pharaoh's going out in the morning to do his washings, and Moses goes out. God sends him there, and he uses the staff, the one that turned into serpents. It's interesting, and I think it's important. Every plague, it mentions what Moses does with his staff. And this one, he strikes the waters of the Nile. And I think this is my opinion, where the staff is directed shows us what it is that he is, the judgment that's coming on the gods of Egypt. So again, I said Nile was worshipped as a god, and you can kind of see it. The floods is what allowed the life. It was called, in fact, it was called sometimes the lifeblood of Egypt, because the floods is what allowed them to have the food and everything that they needed. But God, I should say, by God's power, Moses is able to strike the Nile, and instead of giving life, it becomes something that causes death. So the fish die, they stink, it becomes, instead of the lifeblood of Egypt, it becomes a source of death. And so that's, again, God showing these gods that you're relying on. If you're worshiping the Nile, then you're worshiping the wrong God. You're not understanding what's going on here. So that's the first plague. I was going to talk about, I think, well, there was the plague of the frogs is in there. Look at Exodus chapter 9. Let's look at that plague. And I'm not going to necessarily talk about all these, but what I'm going to basically show is I think that each of these is an attack upon one of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. So go ahead and read verses 1 through 7 there for me.
Yeah. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die.' The Lord set a time and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go."
So there's this, you may see it behind me if you're watching on YouTube, but there's this god that the Egyptians worship called the Apis bull. And it was a ceremonial bull, usually a white bull that was born. There was always one there. They had this sun disk between its horns, basically. And that bull was seen as the god that protected the livestock. And so here's this idea that these livestock die, and probably the Apis bull itself would be affected by this, right? It says all the Egyptian livestock die. Some people see this. There's an interesting thing here too we see with the plagues is the distinction that's made between the people of the Israelites and the Egyptians.
Right.
This distinction I always call a distinction of ownership. All those livestock belonging to the Israelites did not die. And in fact, it says Pharaoh investigated this, and it says he found not a single one of the livestock died. Some people call this a double miracle. Not only is it the miracle of all of the Egyptian livestock dying, but none of the livestock the Israelites die. And so here's this distinction. And that's another thing we're going to see with these plagues. There's a continuing distinction that's being made between God's people and between the Egyptians. So that's another example. Another one of the plagues is this boils that I mentioned, and there was a god that they worshiped that was a god of healing. So here's God, and Moses at that point, you might remember, throws soot into the air, and again it's a way to demonstrate where this attack is going. And so the god that the Egyptians would have relied upon on healing, it says even Pharaoh's family was affected by this and these boils, these terrible boils, but none of the Israelites were affected in this particular instance. So you kind of see what we're beginning to have form here. Any thoughts on that or questions? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really that's an interesting thing. I mean, I don't know if we've ever thought about that before. Like, did God pull these plagues out of a hat?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, right. I've got 500 plagues and I'm pulling out 10 here. And I think it makes more, as I think about the number of plagues, like why so many plagues before God, has Pharaoh let them go, or, before we got to the Passover, but kind of going, that Yahweh is tearing down some of these, powerful images that might be even in the Hebrews vision at that time as well.
Well, and since we're talking about the Apis bull and you mentioned that, let me talk about that. So you remember what happened, and you talked about you're going to go to Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
You remember what happened when Moses went up on the mountain? Not too long after the Israelites had experienced all of God's deliverance in this Exodus, right? They'd seen all these plagues and all of God's power, and yet Moses went up on the mountain to meet with God, and even Mount Sinai talks about the thunder and the lightning and the fire and all the things that they saw there. And while Moses was gone, they said, he's been gone a long time. So what did they? You remember what they did?
I do. They melted down some gold and made themselves a golden calf.
And went to Aaron, who's Moses' brother, and said, "Make for us." And so what he did is made it a golden calf. Where did they get this idea of worshiping an idol? He said, "Here are the gods, O Israel, who led you out of Egypt." We saw this, talked about this last week a little bit with Jeroboam. Same kind of thing, golden calf. Where do you get this idea of idol worship? Well, they were coming out of a polytheistic culture where there were these idols. And we still have examples of these statues that the Egyptians made to their gods, right? And they had all kinds of weird looking things. You look at Ancient Aliens, of course, and they'll tell you, no, never mind, don't do that. But
we're going to see this when I go to Karnak. We're going to see some of these,
right? The carvings and the worship that was done at that period of time, polytheistic. Basically all of the attributes of nature. So another example is the god of the weather. Right, almost any culture that's polytheistic has this weather god, like the later Poseidon and this kind of thing. But you've got this thunderstorm that comes and hail and that turns to fire and destroys the crops. The other aspect of this that I sometimes will mention is all of the advantages that Joseph brought to Egypt are kind of systematically stripped away by these plagues too. I always say there's an economic impact because it talks about the crops that they lose as a result of these things. Just think about the death of the livestock, all of the livestock, the Egyptians dying.
Yeah, that's no one's having burgers for a while.
Right. So it's going to have the way that Joseph saved Egypt in the past from this very difficult period of time now kind of comes back, and it puts them in a very difficult financial situation. And you've even mentioned there, and I'm anxious to see how this goes. There may be some examples of how we even see historically the effects of when Egypt lost suddenly all of these workers and had this severe economic downturn, this economic impact. There's some historians that have written about people who migrated out of Egypt that may be related to the story of the Exodus. And so, it's an interesting to think about those kind of things. So the other plagues I was going to mention just quickly. So I mentioned hail and fire, healing. And then, of course, the ninth plague is the plague. Do you remember that?
Yes. The plague of darkness.
Darkness, right? Okay, now, for much of this period of time, and especially if Ramses is the correct, the one
born of Ra.
Okay, and he was seen as the sun god, the one kind of an eagle sometimes or falcon that carried the sun disk across the sky. Well, this darkness lasted, it says, for 3 days. And it says it was a darkness that could be felt. Now, there's different people who try. There are some people, I'll say, who try to understand all these plagues from a naturalistic explanation. Well, this a darkness that could be felt would be like a sandstorm or whatever, but it's possible. I don't know. But this darkness is a separation again. It's a darkness for 3 days. The sun disk is put out, right? This chief god, this chief god that the Egyptians worshipped for that period of time was shown to be powerless compared to the eternal God, the creator God. And that's really where we're getting to this. That's the next to the last plague. And Pharaoh has one more chance to relent, but of course he doesn't. And that's something maybe we'll talk about another time. Pharaoh's heart will soften, and then his heart hardens. He'll say for a period of time, "Oh, I'm going to let him go," and then he'll change his mind. There's this constant thing, but it gets to the end where Pharaoh's heart is hard, and no matter what happens, it seems like the one that really strikes me is the one we read there, where it says that he even sent to investigate. He sent down people to say, did this really happen the way that Moses said that it would? And even despite the evidence, he continues to harden his heart against the true God. And so that's another part of the whole story that we have here. But the next to last plague, like I said, is this plague of darkness that seems to attack one of these very, very important gods. Of course, Pharaoh himself was seen by the people at various times to be a god, and the family was set apart and seen to be special. And this last plague is the plague of the firstborn. And of course, a horrible thing here, the idea that the firstborn of all of Egypt, both men and also livestock. I should mention this because some people say, well, where did the livestock come from? I thought they were all dead. But this took place over a period of time. We often, again, the way the movies sometimes depict it.
It just happens one day
after the other, a couple of weeks going on here. But no, this is over a period of months. And the reason we can tell is the different crops that are mentioned, like the wheat crop and other crops and just the seasons. So it seems to have been over a more extended period of time. But of course, it ends in the spring. At what we call Passover. And that's this final plague. Now, I mentioned some of the distinctions. We have the distinction of ownership with the cattle. The darkness, it said, did not affect, I say there's a geographic distinction there. It didn't affect the land of Goshen, only the land of Egypt. So it didn't affect where the Israelites resided. But this final plague, the 10th plague, is a pretty interesting distinction because it depends upon, I call it a distinction of obedience, right? Because they were commanded to do certain things. Take a lamb, one without blemish. You're to take this lamb and to eat it all together in one night. They weren't certain regulations about how it was to be done. They were to have their staff in their hands and their sandals on their feet.
Ready to go. And that's kind of a symbolic of this idea. And this Passover becomes for the Israelites and later for the Jewish people, this becomes a remembrance of this central act of redemption, I'm going to call it, from Egyptian slavery. I would say Exodus is the major act of redemption in the Old Testament. And I've pointed this out when we've talked about especially the Gospel of John. We see in the other Gospels as well, the connection between God's major act of redemption overall in Jesus, which takes place in connection with the Passover. You might remember Jesus takes elements of this Passover meal that they continue to remember year after year. They remember God's deliverance. And Jesus takes parts of that and he says, this was pointing to me. He says, this bread is my body, and this cup of redemption that you drink is my blood,
which is now shed for you. And John particularly puts his death in connection with the killing of the lambs that were used. This idea of Jesus as the Passover lamb seems to be John's connection he's making. And then Paul specifically calls him our Passover and says we're celebrating this redemption. So Exodus was a big deal for the Israelites, and like I said, the later Jewish people. It became a huge deal for them that this salvation was being offered to them.
Yeah, the Exodus is like the main thing that we just keep coming back to. You know what I mean? Like it's referred to over and over and over again, and the importance of it in the Jewish life, because it was everything revolved around that. It was the central, like the establishment of God's people. At that point, they're called out. I was thinking about that when you're talking about Moses, like, drawn out of, and then God is using Moses who is that whole concept of drawing out, he's drawing out the Israelites as well through God's
I'll
power.
take you out of Egypt. And there's so many parallels, and this would be a good thing for us to talk about a different time. There's so many parallels between Jesus' life and
Moses.
Well, I was going to say the Israelites in terms of this. You remember Jesus goes down to Egypt, and Matthew says this is to fulfill, out of Egypt I've called my son, which happened with the Israelites and then happened with Jesus as well. One final thing I want to mention. So they, after this happened, then they plundered Egypt. Egyptians at this point are like, you guys, after the death of the
ladies got
firstborn,
to go to their next door neighbors and be like, hey.
Oh, and I forgot to mention this. I was going there. I got sidetracked on the lamb, but they would put the blood on the doorpost, and it's when you see the blood, so it was obedience. It was those who obeyed, even if they were Egyptian. Now that's the interesting thing is connected with this plague. We find those who had believed, even those among, it says, Pharaoh's officials, who believed in basically they'd seen enough. They'd seen what God had done, and so they obey in this. And in chapter 12, in verse, I said they are able to take all these things, and it says in verse, I believe 38 of chapter 12, many other people went up with them when they left Egypt. So it's not only the Israelites, it's not only the descendants of Jacob that go, but the Exodus. And you mentioned they become a people in this, and I think this is very interesting. Because sometimes we have this kind of perception that God was only about Israel in the Old Testament, but it's clear that from the beginnings of this nation, there were other peoples who were part of it, even Egyptians who believed in the Lord God, Yahweh God, and who went up with them from the land on this trip, on this travels. So just an interesting part.
It wasn't ethnically exclusionary.
No, I always say Israel, even in the Old Testament, wasn't only people who would have had Jacob's DNA, right? Not only those who were directly descended from Jacob, but there are others who were part of this community from the very beginning. Of course, we have other examples of that later. Rahab is a good example of that, who becomes pretty central even to the kingly line,
right?
There, the tribe of Judah, because of the man who takes her as a husband, and other examples that we see along the way. But my point is, this is from the very beginnings, because it's in this Exodus. When Joseph's family goes down into Egypt, there are 120 people. When Jacob and Joseph and his brother, when they go down, there's 120 people, extended family, big family, right? Not the kind of family you'd want to have over necessarily, for a weekend barbecue, but a big steaks, big family. But when they leave, they're a nation, and really, it's in this act of Exodus that they also are formed into this people. And that's of course when Moses goes on the law goes on the mountain to receive the law, and that forms them again into this people that God is going to work through and use in order to bring about His promises to the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, that was always one of my things. I was just having this conversation with someone recently about the Exodus, is about how much of a nation identity did they have while they were in while they were in Egypt? And we were having this conversation about this trip and where we're going. It's just, how far were they spread out? You know what I mean? Like we don't have like all the things, but kind of going, did they identify, it's been 400 years since the four patriarchs of the tribes who had been there, and going, how much did they identify and how much did they identify as a unified group, and what that means. And you were talking about the map earlier, and this is one of the things that we're going to talk about in the video I'm shooting that I'm coming back from right now. Is, you talked about the Nile, and just like we looked at the map. Yeah. And we talked about, you're gonna have the pyramids would have been there at this time
already. Yeah,
already.
That's something people don't understand.
And the pyramids have been there for a long time. Yeah. But the Israelites wake up in the shadow of this, and they'll go to sleep in this. But like they're in this place, they're drawn in there from famine. They come to Egypt, but kind of going, the idea of all of them escaping is like you've either got this fertile land or you've got desert. Yeah. And not that they would have known how to live, but kind of going for this whole idea of it, all of them picking up and moving is extraordinary. And it was only, I think, it could only have been an act of God that would have allowed them to move out.
Exactly.
This isn't like a grand escape where they're going to sneak out in the night.
Nope. And it's an act of God, the dividing the Red Sea. And I mentioned the Feast of Passover. One of my favorite feasts is the Tabernacles, which we've talked about in connection with the Gospel of John as well, mentioned specifically there. But Tabernacles was a way that God told his people to remember the way he had provided for them in the wilderness. That you had food, you had shelter, your clothes didn't wear out. Even during that whole 40-year period of time, even after they were disobedient and they traveled for 40 years, when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, it specifically says your clothes did not wear out and your feet did not swell. During that whole 40 years. That's like a pretty remarkable, basically God, even in their disobedience and even in the punishment they received because of their failure to trust in him. And again, think about this. He'd led them through the Red Sea, and then they get to Canaan and they listen to these spies and say, oh, no, I don't think we can. Looks pretty tough,
Yes.
There's your way saying,
get back out in the desert.
I don't get it, you know. But here is this, they failed to trust, essentially. They failed to trust God. And so, this is punishment, but even in their punishment, God provides for them. Every day they ate manna, and God provided water when they needed. He provided even when they complained about having manna every day. I'm tired of manna. He provided for them quail, to eat. And so in all these things, we see God's provision, and it reminds us in our wilderness times that God continues to provide, continues to be able to give us the things that we need in order to continue the journey. So
and I think that's that's the great lesson through all of that stuff. And I that's what I'm excited about on this trip, and coming back from this trip, is that we're going to see again, once you get off that Nile, it's desert. And thinking we're going to be in 4 like Land Rovers moving around in this stuff. But kind of going, once you're out there, you're out there.
You're on your own.
And you think, again, we talked about Solomon last week, like, how do you get there? How do you make those choices? But kind of going, seeing yourself out in that sun, and you see Pharaoh's chariots and them coming behind you, and you see a sea. It's like kind of going, you have to rely on God. And
were there not enough graves in Egypt, Moses? You brought us out here in the desert to die.
Die of thirst and die of no. There was food and there was water for us there. At least we were enslaved.
But what an incredible way that God revealed, and that's what he says. He says not only there's 2 or 3 things that we see in Scripture. I mentioned this idea of the battle, and that's what I've really emphasized today: the battle between the gods of the Egyptians and Moses. And basically, or I should say, the true God showing his superiority over these gods of Egypt. So that's a part of it. But then God also says to Moses, "I am going to reveal who I am. Basically, I'm going to show my people who I am." And later, he also says, "I'm going to show the nations who I am." And it's interesting because that's what we see later, even 40 years later, when they're entering the land of Canaan. the other people are remembering, oh, we know what God did for you down in Egypt. We know what your God did for you down there. And, it's a way that God revealed his power. And like I said, there are some who believed, even who were not descended from Jacob. They became obedient to the Lord. They become followers of Yahweh, as a result of seeing these plagues. And the same with us. We see about the way God provided through Jesus and the way that he has given us, he's become our Passover lamb, as Paul says, and he has provided redemption for us also.
Yeah. And it's a great reminder throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. And for us today, like this callback, it wasn't just for the people that lived through it.
Yep.
It was part of the DNA of the people of remember
every year.
And this Exodus, you know what I mean? Like, remember, your God brought you out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Like, don't forget.
It happens to be, I preached last Sunday a sermon, a couple days ago, yesterday.
When will then be now?
A sermon about remembering. And 15 times in the book of Deuteronomy, which is Moses, you mentioned Mount Nebo, Moses' final sermon to his people, to his, those who he's led for these 40 years, led out of Egypt. His message for them, 15 times he uses this command, remember. And usually it's in reference to what God did for you there. Remember that we too were slaves in Egypt, but God has led us. God delivered us from Egypt.
And this is a new generation too.
Exactly.
So it's like they wouldn't have lived through all of that, but remember what has happened to the people beforehand.
And that's why I think that feast was given to them. It was to remember. And here's the interesting thing: Jesus, on the night that we say institute the Lord's Supper, but he really took the elements of the Passover and applied them to himself. He says, the reason you're to do this is
to remember
me. And, as oft as you eat this bread, as oft as you drink this cup, remember me. I grew up and I can remember in the church, and I've seen this in other churches as well, the communion table up front.
This do in remembrance of me.
In remembrance of me is usually what's engraved on the front of those. And just, again, a reminder of the importance of remembering. And interesting, I've said this before, God gives us these multi-sensory acts, right? Food and the smell, the taste, the texture, all of those things, in order to help us in our memory. It helps us remember. And here it reminds us of the saving act of what God has done in Jesus. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, welcome back. I hope you had a good flight.
I'm sure it was wonderful.
I hope the gears are down and the seat tables. The seat tables are up and your seat belts are on.
Full upright position.
Know. Yeah, I can't even say Brian's Bible Bistro.
No, you
correctly.
can't. No, you can't. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah, and a reminder that we got lots of other episodes. If you like this one, go back and listen to some of the others. And remember to share if you think this is an interesting episode. If it was helpful to you, share it with somebody.
Share. And if you are enjoying the podcast, join us. Join us in this journey. You can support us by going to Patreon, or you can just go to our website, thebiblebistro.com.
Yeah.
And up at the top, there is a button that says support the bistro, and you can sign up to financially support us. And if you support us depending on the level you choose, we have several different levels on there, depending on how much you'd like to support us. You can get a sticker, to put on your lap. Oh, there's a sticker. Yeah, a sticker. There's a sticker, a coffee mug, which everybody wants, and also a t-shirt, so you can support your favorite podcast.
When you're out running or when you're listening, you should just put that t-shirt on when you're listening and kind of get you in the Bible Bistro mood. You can put on the music, our music. Is that how it goes?
Very close. Anyway, thanks so much, Brian. I appreciate it, and we'll chat next Tuesday.
See you next time.
See you. Bye.